when Brigadier General Harmon E. Marshall, retired, walked into my office, I thought he carried himself like a man accustomed to command. He was tall and fit, with a weather-beaten face and bearing. He makes a very impressive impression, I thought. On his arm was Mrs. Marilyn Hart, a wonderful woman in her own right and one of the most eligible widows in Atlanta. When John Hart died unexpectedly 5 years ago from a brain aneurysm, he left his grief-stricken wife alone but extremely wealthy. From then on, one of the favorite games of Atlanta society was to speculate who could comfort the widow in her grief. Now it seemed that the issue had been resolved. Come in, I said, holding out my hand to Mrs. Hart. I'm Sarah Cannon. Nice to meet you. Then I turned to her companion. And you must be General Marshall. I've heard so much about you. Don't believe a word of it, he said with a straight face. But everyone only says good things, I objected. Then you should definitely not believe it, he said with a smile and a wink. How disarming, I thought, inviting them into my office. For such a distinguished soldier to be so self-deprecating is a charming way to win people over. General Marshall did come with a prestigious reputation. He was a decorated officer who fought in the First Gulf War. Unlike most senior officers, General Marshall actually commanded his men in battle and received both a Silver Star and a Purple Heart for his services. General Marshall, I said, would you happen to be related to the famous World War II General George Marshall? He smiled indulgently at me. I am often asked this question. In fact, we are related, but it is a very distant relationship. I think he was my great-uncle. Of course, that doesn't stop me from using his name. Again, I was fascinated by the ease with which he laughed at himself. I settled them on the sofa and brought them a glass of fruit tea. Then I sat down next to them in the chair. So, how can I help you? Marilyn spoke first. Mrs. Cannon. Please, I interrupted. Everyone calls me Miss Sarah. She smiled and nodded. Miss Sarah, my dear friend Emma Woolfolk told me that you are the best family law attorney in Atlanta and that I just had to come to you with this. I didn't know Emma Woolfolk personally, but I knew about her. She, too, was a young widow in Atlanta society, not rich like Marilyn Hart, but certainly very prominent in philanthropic and social activities. Her photos regularly appeared in the gossip column of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper. How nice of her to recommend me, I said. So, what do you need? General Marshall intervened. It will be easier if I explain. Marilyn yielded to him with an adoring look. As you probably know, said the general, Marilyn has agreed to marry me, and our wedding will take place in a few weeks. I've been a lonely old soldier since my wife died many years ago, but Marilyn has brought joy back into my life. Marilyn squeezed his hand in hers and glowed with happiness. The fact is, the general continued, that Marilyn is a rich woman. Although generals receive a good salary, my fortune would be only a small part of hers. The last thing I want is for people to think I'm some kind of opportunist trying to take advantage of her grief after losing her husband. At this, Marilyn frowned and shook her head, indicating that she would never believe such a thing about her fiancé. Accordingly, he continued, I believe the only honest thing on my part is to enter into a prenuptial agreement that will protect Marilyn. We need your help in drawing up such an agreement. I can easily do this, I reassured them, and let me commend you both for being smart about such matters before your marriage. When two people are young and have little or no assets of their own, such issues are not as important. But when both parties are adults, making an agreement in advance can avoid future problems, especially in the event of a divorce. Marilyn was clearly upset by my last statement. Harm and I are deeply in love, Miss Sarah, and there is no possibility of us being separated. If I were you, Marilyn, I would take General Marshall's wish as a very tangible sign of how much he loves you, I assured her. She sighed at my words. I didn't think about it, she said. She squeezed his hand even tighter. We then discussed the elements that are typically included in prenuptial agreements. However, as I was about to finish, General Marshall interrupted me. There is one more thing, Miss Sarah. In the event of a divorce, according to the agreement you described, we part with the same assets that we had at the time of marriage. But that's not enough for me. He cleared his throat. I want Marilyn to know that I will love and respect her forever, to the exclusion of all others. Accordingly, I want it to be written that if I break my marriage vows and commit adultery, I automatically forfeit half of my current and future assets to her. This is the only way I can show her how serious I am about loving her forever. Marilyn gasped at his unexpected proposal. "Oh, Harm," she said in an adoring tone, "what a wonderful, selfless husband you will be." Then she turned to me. "Miss Sarah, the only way I will accept Harm's offer is if it includes me. I want Harm to know that I loved him as much as he loved me." "But Marilyn," I countered, "even without the financial documents we have already agreed that there is a significant difference between your wealth and the general's. I really cannot advise such a condition." "It doesn't matter," she said majestically. "It will never be questioned. The important principle is, Harm loves me unconditionally, and I want him to know that I am no less devoted to him." With these words, she put her arms around his neck, and they embraced in front of me. When we finished, they left holding each other's hands. I was still not sure what Marilyn wanted to do, but it was clear that they would not be convinced, and I have to admit that they really seemed to be deeply in love. Besides, I thought, it was General Marshall who proposed this agreement in the first place. It was not difficult to draw up the contract as they indicated, and I sent them 2 copies for review. If they were satisfied, I invited them to keep the signed copy and send one to me for safekeeping. Considering how busy they were with wedding preparations, I assumed it would be a while before I saw them or the deal again. As for me, I also had problems related to my marriage. I haven't had an assistant for several weeks, not since my last assistant, Cindy McCarthy, married. I hoped I could keep her even after she got engaged because she was so smart and capable. And to be honest, I've watched her grow from a recent graduate college girl who acted more like a teenager into a mature young woman ready to take the next step in her life. It may be a natural part of life, but it's still always a little painful to watch one of your chicks leave the nest. But now that she was gone, I couldn't deny the reality any longer. I urgently needed a new assistant, so I followed my usual routine and contacted the placement office at Agnes Scott College, my alma mater. I liked choosing my assistants from Agnes Scott because I knew that I would find smart and decent people there. It was also my way of giving back to the school. Mrs. Ryan had headed the career planning office for many years and had recommended many former assistants to me. However, when I called her this time, she made an unexpected offer. "I know you're usually looking for recent graduates, Miss Sarah, but would you consider a graduate who graduated 4 years ago? She is interested in a career in law and has a background that interests you." I was hesitant, but Mrs. Ryan never lets me down, so I asked her for more details. "Miss Sarah, she is in my office now. Why don't I send her to you so you can meet in person? I think you'll be impressed by her." I reluctantly agreed. I didn't like buying a pig in a poke, but I was ready to give the Agnes Scott graduate a chance. About an hour later, there was a knock on the glass doors of my home, which also serves as my office. When I opened the door, a tall, slender African-American woman stood in front of me. She wore a dark blue suit with a skirt and jacket over a white high-collared blouse. Her shoes were black and utilitarian. Definitely not a slave to fashion, I thought inappropriately. She extended her hand to me rather awkwardly. "Mrs. Cannon, my name is Marcella Jackson. Mrs. Ryan sent it to me." "Come in," I said, and invited her into my office. She headed towards the chair in front of my desk, but I directed her towards the sofa. "It will be less formal here," I said. After I offered her a glass of fruit tea, I sat down opposite her. "Tell me a little about yourself, Miss Jackson," I asked. "What did you do after graduation, and how did you become interested in law?" "Mrs. Cannon," she began, but I interrupted her. "Most people call me Miss Sarah," I said. She nodded. "Okay, Miss Sarah. After graduation, I entered the service. I spent the last 4 years in the Army. I was surprised. I doubt that many Agnes Scott graduates choose a military career. What made you do this? She grinned. A couple of reasons. The main thing was that my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all served in the Army, and I am an only child. My fate was sealed before I was born. The second reason is pure pragmatism. I realized that the only way I could afford law school was through the GI Bill. I nodded. It's logical. Where did you serve? In Afghanistan, madam. Now I was impressed. It must have been an amazing experience. Her eyes focused on something far away. Yes, madam. I saw things there that I don't think I'll ever forget. Now you want to gain experience in law, I said, trying to distract her from the obviously painful memories. She returned to the present. This is true. I wanted to go straight to law school, but Mrs. Ryan suggested I get some practical experience first to see if it was the right fit for me. We talked for a long time about her experience and interests. She was an impressive young woman. She was a historian at Agnes Scott College and a good student. Since she wanted to join the military and was a college graduate, I would assume she would go to officer candidate school. Instead, she chose general infantry and completed basic combat training because she wanted to follow the same path as the men in her family. After 4 years of service, including a combat tour in Afghanistan, she decided she did not want to pursue a career in the military. She didn't tell me about her experience there, but I realized that she had lost several close friends. As she brought her story to the present, I told her a little about what I do, how my office works, and what help I need. Finally, I asked her what she thought about what I said. She took a deep breath and said, "Miss Sarah, I have to be honest with you. I don't think I'm the right person for this job." "About?" I said in surprise. "Why not? I thought this was what you wanted." "I really want to study law," she said energetically, "but not this type of law. I want to help poor people with their legal problems, not work with rich people arguing over who gets a country estate." Interesting, I thought. She's quite lively. It won't be easy for me with her. But thinking about it, I felt interested. I knew she was smart and idealistic, and I respected her military service. And Mrs. Ryan saw something in her too. Spontaneously, I decided to take a risk. I smiled at her. "I think you will find that so many of the problems that poor people face relate to family law, and that the problems are the same regardless of income. In any case, I can assure you that I work with all types of clients and do not perform a means test. The one thing that all my clients have in common is the need to protect the law." I straightened up. "How about this? You sign up with me for a 3-month trial period. If I feel that you are not coping, we will shake hands and part without hard feelings." I noticed she frowned when I said probationary period, so I hurried to continue. "In the meantime, I will be on probation with you. If you feel that this is not what you want to do, or if you decide that you just don't like working with me, you can leave without consequences. In the meantime, I think you'll learn a lot about the practice of law in the real world, and at least you're unlikely to get shot here." She chuckled at the last comment, but I noticed that she was still undecided. But apparently, she could also make quick decisions. "Okay, Miss Sarah, if you're willing to take a chance on me, I think I should be willing to take a chance on you too." With these words, she extended her hand, and we shook hands. "So," I said, "if we work together, what should I call you?" "Oh," she said, embarrassed that we hadn't established that yet, "please call me Marcy. That's what my family calls me." The first few weeks with Marcy were interesting. On the one hand, she was a quick learner and a hard worker. She was interested in everything I did and why I did it, so much so that I often had to kick her out at the end of the day. She was also extremely organized, more so than I was, to be honest. On the other hand, she was very formal. Maybe I was thinking too much about her past, but it seemed like she was holding herself back from standing at attention every time I walked into the room. It was funny at first, But then I started to feel frustrated that she couldn't relax around me. I thought we were starting to make progress, but then something would raise her guard again. For example, when I received the signed prenuptial agreement from Marilyn Hart and General Marshall, I showed it to Marcy as one example of my work. "Oh, I heard about them," she said scornfully. "She's that rich widow who marries a general who doesn't even know how to salute properly. These are exactly the people I don't want to work with." I was surprised by her indignation. Now, Marcy, Mrs. Hart cannot change the fact that her husband died and left her a fortune. As for General Marshall, what's wrong with his salute? "I saw him on the local news one time," she said, "and his salute would have gotten me a reprimand from my instructor." "I believe there are more important things to a brigadier general than his salute," I said, but Marcy was not convinced. I just sighed and left it at that. Patience is a virtue, I reminded myself. Her next learning experience came a few days later when I received a call from an old friend who wanted to come and ask for my help. We made an appointment, and I asked Marcy to attend. When the appointed time arrived, she was closest to the door when a knock announced the arrival of our visitor. Opening the door, she saw an elderly African-American man accompanying a woman young enough to be his daughter. "Marcy," I said, "let me introduce you to Lucius Rayford, an old friend and member of my church. Lucius, this is Marcella Jackson, my new legal assistant." Lucius smiled friendly and shook Marcy's hand. "Hello, hello," he said. He then turned to the woman next to him. "And this is Cora Hopewell, the young woman I told you about." Marcy and I greeted her and showed them to my office. Marcy sat everyone down and I poured everyone some fruit tea that was ready. Once everyone was settled, Lucius explained the reason for their visit. "Cora has worked for my wife and I for the last 2 years, and she is a great worker. But now she has problems. Her husband wants a divorce, and she doesn't know what to do. I told her I knew exactly the person who could help, and then I called you." I smiled at Lucius, then turned to the young woman, whose eyes were full of tears. "Mrs. Hopewell, I am very sorry for your misfortune. Can you tell me what happened?" "Miss Sarah, I don't really know what happened. Gerald and I were married for a while, and our relationship wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad either, if you know what I mean. But last week he came home and said he found someone he likes more than me and wants a divorce. I would never have believed it." With these words, she began to cry quietly. Lucius hugged her fatherly. "She's taking it very hard, and when some guy came and handed her documents, she just lost her composure. I told her she needed a lawyer to make sure she was being treated fairly, and that's when I called you." "You did exactly the right thing, Lucius," I assured him. I took the young woman's hand. "Mrs. Hopewell, if your husband no longer wants to be married, there is nothing we can do to stop him. But what we can do is make sure you are protected and treated fairly. That's what the law is for." "I just feel so helpless, Miss Sarah," Cora said. "Gerald always took care of everything, paid all the bills, and bought everything we needed. Now he's gone, and I don't know where to start." "I think we can help with that too," I said. "Marcy, can you meet with Cora and help her sort out her budget?" When Marcy nodded vigorously, I turned to Cora and Lucius. "Marcy is one of the most organized people I know. She will quickly get you in order. In the meantime, let me pick up the documents you were served, and I will contact Gerald's lawyer to begin working on an agreement." Cora looked a little more encouraged as she and Lucius headed towards the door. Before leaving, Lucius hugged me. "Thank you, Miss Sarah," he said. "She was so depressed that I just had to try to help her. Now I know she is in good hands." "Thank you, Lucius. We will do our best," I said. "Please give my best wishes to Mabel." After they left, Marcy seemed unusually quiet. A minute later, she came up to me. "I didn't realize you worked with ghetto clients, Miss Sarah." "Make no mistake," I told her. "Lucius Rayford, a successful, wealthy businessman. He and his wife founded a cleaning company 30 years ago. Today, they own one of the largest cleaning services in Atlanta. At the same time, I can tell you that he never forgot his roots and gave a start to dozens of young men and women who needed work. Cora Hopewell is one of the last of these cases. Well, I'll be very glad to meet Cora, Marcy replied. I feel like I can really help her get organized. She's the person I was hoping to work with. I'm sure you can help her, honey, I said. But I have a question, Marcy continued. Why didn't you ask her for an advance before she left? I thought this was your usual practice. Well, it was pretty obvious that she couldn't afford to pay me right now. Then I winked at Marcy. When you go to Cora, if you see that she's doing better than I thought, maybe I'll ask for an advance then. Marcy just looked at me thoughtfully. I think she didn't know how to treat me. The next day, Marcy contacted Cora to set up an appointment for help with her financial situation. At this time, I contacted Cora's husband's lawyer to discuss the agreement. John Baxter was a good lawyer and a decent man. I have already worked with him on several cases and found him to be an honest person. After exchanging pleasantries, we got down to business. John, I'm calling about Hopewell v. Hopewell. I represent Corette Hopewell in this matter. Frankly, my client does not want a divorce, but Mr. Hopewell seems inclined to do so, so I would like to discuss an agreement with you. Yes, he replied. He gave me no reason to believe that he had an interest in reconciliation, so I asked him to provide me with financial statements. I assume you will do the same with Mrs. Hopewell. There's nothing to provide, I said. It was one of those marriages where the husband controlled all the finances. Cora simply handed over her salary to Gerald every 2 weeks, and he took care of everything. She has no funds of her own. We can provide copies of her payslips if necessary, but Mr. Hopewell should already have all of this information. I could almost see John nodding on the other end of the line. This is a fairly common situation among my clients, Miss Sarah. Well, Mr. Hopewell promised to give me the information by tomorrow. As soon as it arrives, I will email it to you. Once we get that, I think we can work things out quickly. It will be wonderful, John. I will contact you shortly after I receive his report. Good man, I thought after we hung up. I like working with people who don't play games. The next day, as I was working at my desk, Marcy returned from her meeting with Cora Hopewell. She didn't seem too cheerful when I asked how it went. It's worse than I thought, Marcy said indignantly, talking about her meeting. Cora is very sweet, but she has not the slightest idea about their finances. She doesn't know how much money they have in the bank, she doesn't know how much Gerald earns, and she has no idea about the family budget. All she has is a stack of bills that came in after Gerald left. How can a woman allow such a situation to happen? Well, there are a lot of men who feel it's their responsibility to manage the family's finances, I said. It's more like a way to keep your wives under control, she snorted. Yes, I agreed. I saw it that way too. Well, she continued, I won't know how bad it is until we get an idea of how much money they have in the bank. But I'm already sure that Cora won't be able to afford their apartment. Most likely, she will have to move back in with her parents and find a second job to sort things out. I will never allow myself to be in such a situation, she was indignant. Never. I had already seen Marcy's independent nature, so I wasn't surprised by her reaction. But I didn't want her to intimidate poor Corey, so she warned her. Just remember that Cora needs you as a mentor, not as a strict commander. Marcy was caught off guard by my comment, but she quickly recovered. She snapped to attention, gave me a perfect military salute, and said, Madam, yes, madam. But I noticed that she smiled slightly and felt that she understood what I was trying to say. The next day, when the financial statements arrived from lawyer Gerald Hopewell, Marcy was naturally eager to see them so she could help Cora with the budget. We both looked at each other dejectedly when we saw the dry details. Gerald's weekly earnings were about the same as Cora's. The Hopewells had no savings account and a small balance in Gerald's account. It was obvious that they were living paycheck to paycheck. There were no easy solutions to Cora's financial problems. How can two people live like this? Marcy asked irritably. I know they both earn a little money, But this is absurd. I saw the bills Cora received. What did they spend their money on? I had already noticed that Marcy was a disciplined person, and she seemed to me to be quite intolerant of those who were not. Marcy already had a meeting scheduled with Cora. I was afraid that their next meeting might not be very pleasant. But when she returned from the second meeting, Marcy was thoughtful. I asked how it went. "Not bad," she said, "but something very interesting happened after I left. I went to the ATM to withdraw some cash and guess who was in front of me? Gerald Hopewell. I recognized him from all the photographs that Cora has in their apartment." "Well," I said, "that's an interesting coincidence, but I don't see why it's important." "Can I look at their financial statements again, Miss Sarah?" she asked. When I handed it to her, she quickly scanned it and then looked up with blazing eyes. "I was right. Look, Miss Sarah, it says here that they have an account with SunTrust. But Gerald was making a transaction at a Citizens and Southern ATM." "How interesting," I said. "There is no mention of a second bill here. I think I need to call John Baxter." When I contacted him, John was as friendly as ever. "Good morning, Miss Sarah. Have you received the Hopewell financial statements?" "I got it, John," I replied, "but I have a problem. We believe that it is incomplete. Your customer was seen making a transaction at a Citizens and Southern ATM, but there is no mention of a C&S account. I could get a subpoena to force the bank to disclose any accounts Mr. Hopewell may have, but that would be time-consuming and expensive. And if such an account is disclosed, it will be clear evidence of attempted fraud. So I thought I'd first see if you could persuade Mr. Hopewell to restate his financial statements, this time to reflect all of his accounts." "Miss Sarah, this is very awkward. I took Mr. Hopewell's report at face value. I didn't know he might be trying to hide assets. I can assure you that I will speak to him immediately and clearly and understand the possible consequences if he tries to commit fraud. You will receive a revised report very soon. I'm sorry about that. That's not my way of doing things, Miss Sarah." "No need to apologize, John," I assured him. "I know you're not like that. If we can get an honest report from Mr. Hopewell, we can work things out quickly." Indeed, by that day I had received a revised report from John, and it followed the phone call. When I encountered Gerald about the hidden account, he immediately confessed. His attitude was, if you don't try, you won't get it. I made it clear to him that this attitude could very well land him in jail. I cannot promise that he has reformed, but I trust that you have in your hands an accurate account of their finances. I thanked John for his prompt response and went to show Marcy the revised report. She was relieved to learn that Cora's financial situation would be better than she had originally feared. She'll still have to save and save, but at least she'll have enough money to pay off all her bills. She was so pleased that she came over and gave me a little hug, which made me happy too. Maybe we're making a little progress after all, I thought. A few days later, when Cora had to come in to sign some papers, she was clearly grateful to Marcy for all her help. After signing the documents, she especially thanked Marcy. I was pleased to see that Lucius Rayford accompanied her again. He was also full of praise. "Thank you, Miss Sarah, thank you. I really appreciate that you took care of Peels," he said sincerely. "She was so depressed, but now, thanks to you, she's almost back to normal." "You are very kind, Lucius," I replied, "but all we did was make sure that Cora received the legal protection she deserves. Besides, Marcy did the real work. She helped Cora get her finances in order and discovered Gerald's hidden bank account." Marcy looked away in embarrassment, but I noticed that she was pleased with my words. "Thank you too, Miss Marcy," Lucius added. "Cora became like another daughter to Mabel and me. What you did for her will change her life." As the older gentleman and young woman prepared to leave, Cora walked up to Marcy and hugged her, to Marcy's pleasant surprise. "You were like a big sister to me," she told Marcy sincerely. The young woman then left with Lucius. After they left, Marcy came up to me. "Miss Sarah, you shouldn't have said that to Mr. Rayford. I haven't really done that much." "Nonsense," I replied. "You were observant, remembered key details, and drew correct conclusions based on the facts. These are important qualities in the practice of law. "Thank you, madam," she said. "I really appreciate it." I started to think that I had made the right choice after all. After the settlement of Cora Hopewell's case, I expected the office to be quiet for a while, but I was soon reminded how unpredictable life can be. Late one morning a week later, the door burst open and Marilyn Hart burst in, tears streaming down her face. Marcy and I both rushed to her side as it looked like she might fall at any moment. We took her to my office and sat her down on the sofa. Marilyn, what happened? What happened?" I asked her insistently. Unable to speak, she thrust a large envelope into my hands. When I opened it, I immediately learned that it was a divorce suit. As I scanned the contents, I was shocked to see that her new husband, General Marshall, was filing for divorce. What was even more stunning was that his lawsuit was based on treason. Marcy had already brought Marilyn a glass of sweet tea, and after a few sips Marilyn managed to pull herself together. "Oh, Miss Sarah, you have to help me. I don't know who else to turn to." I patted her hand. "Tell me what happened, Marilyn." "I was shopping today," she told us, "and when I got home, I noticed a car parked in front of my house. Before I could close the gate, a car drove into my yard. A stranger approached me and asked if I was General Marshall's wife. When I said yes, he handed me these documents and said that they were handed to me. I didn't understand what he was talking about, but he had already turned and left." She stopped to catch her breath. When I opened the envelope and read the documents, I couldn't believe it. I knew there had to be a mistake, so I tried to call Harm's cell phone, but the call went to voicemail. I didn't know what to do, so I went to your office. This all sounds like a terrible nightmare, Miss Sarah. Please help me." "Of course I will, Marilyn," I assured her. "But first, let me ask a few questions. Did you and your husband have any problems?" "No, of course not," she said, starting to cry again. "We've only been married a couple of months. We're still on our honeymoon." "Was there a time when you and Harm weren't together?" I asked. She thought about it. "Yes, I left town last week," Marilyn told us. "Emma Woolfolk and I went to Macon to visit my mother. Harm had business at the Pentagon, so he couldn't go." "While you were in Macon, where did you stay?" "At my mother's. She lives alone there. My dad died about 7 years ago." "And while you were there, did you see anyone else besides your mother?" "Yeah, my sister lives there, and I also have some cousins in the area, so Emma and I went to visit them." "Have you spent time with anyone other than your family?" "Well, one night my sister had a party, and there were a lot of people there, including some old school friends. But other than that, I just stayed with my family." I sighed. "Marilyn, forgive me for asking this question, but I need to know, have you been in a relationship with someone other than your husband since your marriage?" "Oh, Miss Sarah, how can you think that? Of course not." "Sorry, Marilyn, but you have to understand that others will ask the same question, and they won't be as sympathetic as I am." At this, Marilyn began to cry again. "What is happening to me? First, my husband wants to divorce me, and now my reputation will be ruined." I squeezed her hand and said in as confident a voice as I could, "You have to be strong, Marilyn. Let me handle the legal side. You need to go home and rest. My strong advice is to stay home and avoid talking to anyone outside of the family until we know what's going on." After we put her in the car and sent her home to Buckhead, Marcy and I met again inside. She shook her head. "I didn't expect this," she remarked ironically. "For a marriage to end just 3 months after it started, and with the husband accused of cheating, rich people really live different lives." I smiled at her comment but didn't say anything. Over the years of practice, I have seen much stranger things. Instead, I wanted Marcy to focus on reality. "What is your opinion of Mrs. Hart?" I asked her. Marcy thought about it. "Well, she definitely seemed genuinely depressed. The only question is whether she's upset about the end of the marriage or because she got caught cheating." "Oh," I said in surprise, "do you really think she cheated?" No, not really, she admitted, but I think that if we are going to represent her, we should be prepared for the fact that she did cheat on the general. This is good, I thought. Marcy doesn't jump to conclusions. She tries to look at the problem from both sides. I decided to play devil's advocate with her. Okay, let's assume for a moment that Marilyn actually had an affair. If so, why would she do it so soon after marriage? Marcy thought for a minute, then replied, let's say she had an old high school sweetheart. What if she met him in Macon and sparks flew? She thought her husband would never find out and just let herself relax. But don't forget that she signed a prenuptial agreement with her husband that will cost her millions if she is caught cheating, I reminded her. Marcy thought for a minute. Well, since they were both out of town, she probably never thought she'd get caught. Marcy stopped, or maybe her brain wasn't the organ that was guiding her at the time, she said, winking at me. These are all possibilities, I agreed, but none of them seem very likely. Marilyn clearly seemed like a woman in love when she and General Marshall first came to discuss the agreement, and she seemed like a woman in real pain today. It's always possible that she's a great actress who can turn her emotions on and off, but I kind of doubt it. So, I continued, let's look at this from the other side. If I am General Marshall, for what reason would I want to divorce Marilyn Hart? Well, Marcy suggested, with the prenuptial agreement they signed, he could get a lot of money in the division of property. That's true, I said, but if he stays with her, he'll have twice as much. From a monetary standpoint, it makes much more sense for them to stay married. That's true, Marcy agreed. So maybe it's a matter of infidelity after all. Perhaps she really cheated on him and he found out. I just don't know what to believe. It's really confusing right now, I agreed. The only thing we can do at this point is to contact General Marshall's lawyer and try to find out more about their case. I took the divorce case and looked at who the general hired as his lawyer. Well, that's interesting, I said when I saw the name. Who is it, Miss Sarah? Asked Marcy. The general is represented by Mr. Forrest Howell, a lawyer with the firm of Mason, Tosin, and Donovan, I told her. When she looked at me in disbelief, I continued. This is a large New York law firm that just opened a branch here in Atlanta. Looks like the general has brought in some big artillery. Because Mr. Howell kindly included his phone number in the claim, I was able to contact his office that same day and schedule an initial appointment for the next day. At least they are efficient, I thought. When I came down the next day to start my day at the office, Marcy was already there. You'd better take a look at this, Miss Sarah, she said grimly. She led me to her computer and showed me a website called Atlanta Gossip Girl. What am I looking at? I asked her. This is a daily blog that brings out gossip about people in Atlanta. It usually focuses on sports and entertainment figures, but look at the lead story today, she said, directing my attention to the lead story. Heart romance? Atlanta Gossip Girl has learned that General Harm Marshall and socialite Marilyn Hart, who tied the knot just 3 months ago in one of the biggest weddings this city has ever seen, are on the verge of divorce. Rumor has it that the lady was caught in infidelity, and now the general's heart is broken. Oh, what a naughty girl. The story was accompanied by photographs of General Marshall and Marilyn Hart Marshall. Oh God, I said. Is this a widely read publication? Oh yes, Marcy assured me. You can be sure that such news will become the main topic of discussion in the city. We need to get to Marilyn's house urgently, I said quickly. We got into my car and headed to West Pacific Ferry Road, where Marilyn lived, not far from the governor's residence. As we drove down the shady road past the stately homes lining the street, Marcy couldn't help but whistle softly. At this time, I tried to call Marilyn on her cell phone, but every time I said, "Hello," she hung up. Finally, as we were approaching her house, I called again and quickly shouted, "Don't hang up, Marilyn, it's Sarah Cannon." "Oh, Mrs. Sarah, thank God, I'm going crazy here. Marilyn, Marcy and I are almost at your house. Just open the gate for us when we arrive." "Oh no, Mrs. Sarah," she said urgently. You can't go through the main entrance. There are reporters and cameras, I don't know what else. You need to arrive at the rear through the delivery entrance. You can get there from Tuxedo Road. As we drove past the front entrance to Marilyn's house, I saw that she wasn't exaggerating. Several cars parked along the road in front of her house, and a small crowd of people gathered there. As we pulled up to the back of her rather luxurious home, Marilyn quickly opened the back door and just as quickly closed and locked it behind us. As we settled into her living room, Marilyn offered us coffee and began recounting the morning's events. But she didn't have time to go far when the phone rang. Hearing the bell, she began to moan. They won't leave me alone. They keep calling and pestering me with questions. I don't know what to tell them. Leave it to us, I told her. I turned to my wide-eyed assistant. Marcy, I have to leave soon for a meeting with General Marshall's lawyer. I need you to stay with Marilyn and answer these calls. But what should I say, Mrs. Sarah? Marcy asked uncertainty. Can you confirm that Mrs. Marshall received a copy of the divorce petition filed by her husband, as this is common knowledge? You can also say that she asked me to be her lawyer in this matter, and that I advised her not to make any comments as we prefer to resolve this through the legal system. If someone introduces themselves as a friend or relative, simply write down their name and number and tell them that Marilyn will try to call them back later. What if they don't agree? Marcy asked worriedly. What if they don't take no for an answer? She was understandably nervous. I knew she had never done anything like this before. I squeezed her hand and said in a quiet voice, "You were under fire in Afghanistan, Marcy. If you can handle that, I know you can handle this." With these words, she straightened her shoulders and assumed a determined look. I realized that she could handle it. I turned to Marilyn, who stopped crying to listen to us. Marilyn, I want you to relax and calm down. I have complete confidence in Marcy. She can handle all these nosy people until we figure out what's really going on. Thank you, Mrs. Sarah, Marilyn replied. She then turned to Marcy. And thank you, Miss Marcy. I feel so much better knowing that you will be here with me. I could see that Marcy was still nervous about her new assignment, but I also noticed that she was touched by Marilyn's obvious sincerity. Don't worry about anything, she said boldly. I'll hold the line until Mrs. Sarah returns. I love seeing a young woman with such determination. It's time to head to the Mason offices for a meeting. Tosin and Donovan. Their offices were in downtown Atlanta, so I reluctantly took busy I-75 South. Luckily, the traffic was a little lighter than usual, so I was able to pull into the parking lot and head to the elevator a few minutes before my scheduled appointment time. I hate being late. When I got to their floor, I was greeted by a beautiful young woman in the lobby and escorted to Forrest Howell's office. He rose from his desk as I entered and shook my hand cordially. As we both sat down, he said, "Well, Mrs. Cannon, it's so nice to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you. Please remind me what company you work for." I smiled. "Not for any company, Mr. Howell. I work alone." I saw that he was embarrassed, but he tried his best to correct the situation. Of course, I forgot. I could almost hear the wheels in his head starting to spin. He thought it would be easy, I thought. Before we started, I decided to chat with him a little to better understand who I was dealing with. It's always good to know who you're dealing with. So tell me, Mr. Howell, why a prominent New York law firm like Mason Tosin and Donovan have you decided to open an office in Atlanta? "Oh, we've had our eye on your beautiful city for a long time," he replied, "but we decided to let our competitors test the market before making a move. Now we believe that the city is ready and the time has come," he said rather pompously. This sounds like it was written by some PR agent, I thought. Of course, I knew what this really meant. MTD had missed the boat and was now trying to make up for lost time. "Now that you're here, how do you like Atlanta, Mr. Howell?" I asked. "Very well, of course, Mrs. Cannon," he replied generously. "The weather is great, especially compared to winters in New York. Housing prices are much more reasonable, and the people are warm and friendly. I just love hearing that slow Southern accent." I smiled and nodded. In my experience, people from other places often associate slow speech with slow mental abilities. I have already used this mistake to my advantage. Well, we are very glad to have such a reputable law firm among us, I assured him. However, I'm a little surprised that your firm is involved in family law. I thought you were focused on corporate law. You are right, of course, Mrs. Cannon. Corporate law is our specialization. However, when such a famous person as General Marshall asks us for help, we consider it our duty to respond, he explained. I didn't need a translator to understand what he was saying. MTD hoped that a high-profile divorce case in high society would help improve their reputation and attract new clients among influential people in the city. And for these influential people to hear about the case, I assumed that MTD most likely spread the news local gossip, although I knew they would never admit it. It's not very ethical, I thought, but this isn't the first time a publicity-seeking law firm has used a PR team. And, I reminded myself, they're probably expecting large fees, especially since I'm sure they think Marilyn will pay. Well, Mr. Howell, despite all this pleasantness, I think it's time for us to get down to business. I was surprised that the divorce petition included an allegation of infidelity, I said. Oh, that's not an accusation, Mrs. Cannon, Howell replied smoothly. We have a witness to how Mrs. Marshall violated her marital obligations. Witness, I exclaimed in surprise. I can hardly believe it. I'm afraid so, Howell said, rubbing his hands with pleasure. We have an affidavit. Want to get a copy? Of course I want to, I said sharply. He was clearly expecting this request because he took a copy out of his top desk drawer and handed it to me. I quickly scanned the document with my eyes. The gist of the statement was that Marilyn left during a party in Macon. When the witness went to check on her, she found her in bed hugging a man. It was all quite shocking. But what really struck me was the signature at the end of the statement. Emma Woolfolk, best friend of Marilyn Hart. Howell clearly felt his advantage, so he continued to insist. Given the evidence, Mrs. Cannon, we believe that it is in your client's best interests not to bring this matter to trial. The prenuptial agreement, which I understand you yourself drafted, contains an unambiguous formula for the division of property in the event of such a situation. If your client agrees to follow this agreement, I think we can quickly and without further gossip settle all these troubles like those that were going around this morning. I sank down in my chair. While I didn't like the implied threat in his latest statement at all, I didn't have a ready answer to this shocking development. After some thought, I sat up straight and prepared to leave. Thank you, Mr. Howell. You've given me a lot to think about. I will, of course, need to discuss this with Mrs. Marshall and find out how she wants to proceed. I think you'll hear from me soon. Thank you, Mrs. Cannon, he said pleasantly, obviously sensing the approach of victory. It was nice to meet you. I'm sure so, I thought. When I pulled up to the service entrance of Marilyn Hart's house, I was not looking forward to the upcoming meeting. Marcy let me in and started asking me questions about how the meeting went. I put aside her questions and asked how they were doing here. It's a good thing I was here, Mrs. Sarah, Marcy exclaimed. The phone rang almost non-stop. She held up several sheets of paper, and I saw that each call was annotated. Time, duration, caller, subject of conversation, and number to call back. Well, I see you still have the army, I joked. At that moment, Marilyn entered the room. Don't pester Marcy, Mrs. Sarah, she said energetically. She was great. She handled all those calls like a pro, and I could tell some of them were pretty nasty. Someone even came to the door pretending to be a delivery person. Marcy didn't let him fool her and shooed him away. Marcy modestly lowered her eyes, and I was impressed by Marilyn's praise. My former army assistant seemed to make a positive impression. But then I remembered what I had to do, and my mood darkened. I invited everyone to sit down. It will be hard, and there is no point in putting it off any longer. Marilyn, my meeting with Forrest Howell was unsuccessful. Their office has pretty good evidence that you did, in fact, break your marital vows while you were in Macon. Marcy gasped, and Marilyn began to protest. It's not true. I didn't do anything like that. How can there be evidence if I didn't do anything? Marilyn, I said sternly, were you at your sister's party when you were in Macon? Of course, she answered. I already told you about this. And during the party, I continued, you went up to one of the bedrooms. She thought for a moment and then replied, yes, I remember. I was a little tired and went to lie down for a few minutes. And while you were in that bedroom, did you have any romantic or sexual contact with a man? Absolutely not. Marilyn objected energetically. I took a little nap. Then, when I woke up, I went to the bathroom, freshened up my face, and went back to the party. There was no one there, and certainly no man. I'm afraid that's not what's written in this affidavit. According to him, you had sexual intercourse with a man while you were in that bedroom. With what man? She screamed. There was no man there, no one at all. Who is speaking? The witness couldn't identify the man in the dark room, I said, but you were identified by your clothes and the rings on your hands. Marilyn was almost beside herself. It's impossible. There was no one there. I didn't do anything like that. Who's lying about me? The testimony was dictated and sworn to by your best friend Emma. Woolfolk, I said sadly. Marilyn looked like she had been slapped in the face. Her eyes darted around in confusion, and her lips moved, but made no sounds. Finally, she collapsed on the sofa in another fit of tears. Why is she doing this? Why is Emma lying about me? Why? Marcy and I were concerned about her condition. She seemed so upset. We helped her back to the bedroom and, having persuaded her to lie down, covered her with a blanket. After such a day, I knew that she was both physically and emotionally exhausted. Try to rest, Marilyn, I said. Marcy and I will come by tomorrow. And let's start working on how best to deal with all of this. When we left her dark room, she was already falling asleep. I told Marcy, I don't think it's a good idea to leave Marilyn alone right now. I want you to stay with her for a few days until things calm down. Returning to Virginia Highland, where my office is located, I was curious to see what Marcy now thought of our client. The other day, I began, it seemed likely to you that Marilyn might be unfaithful. Do you still think so? No, Mrs. Sarah, she answered so decisively that I was surprised. What made you change your mind? I asked. Serving in the military taught me a lot about people under pressure, she said. Today was a very busy day for Marilyn, but she was always kind and polite to me. She cooked me lunch and brought it to me when I was busy on the phone and took the time to learn about me and my background when the phone wasn't ringing. I guess what I'm saying is that even though she was upset and concerned, she treated me like a person and not like an employee. I find it hard to believe that someone who is so nice to a stranger in difficult circumstances could be selfish and disrespectful to her husband, she finished. I was glad to hear what Marcy had to say because her answer was insightful. If it makes any difference, I told her, I agree with you. But what matters is what the court decides, and right now all the evidence is against Marilyn Hart. So you and I are going to have to start digging and see if we can't find something to help her cause. Where do we start, Mrs. Sarah? I'd say the obvious place to start is with the three main players in our little drama, the General, Marilyn, and Emma Woolfolk. Why don't you find out what you can find about each of them? I'll take my laptop with me and work from Marilyn's house when I'm not answering calls, she promised. The next week was a very busy one for us. The good news was that within a day or two, the press's attention had shifted away from Marilyn and her alleged infidelity. The crowd at Marilyn's house disappeared, and no more juicy details appeared from the gossip. Marcy was delighted by this development, but I warned her that this only meant that the General's law firm had temporarily withdrawn its dogs, hoping for a quick agreement with us. It could start again at any time if they think we're stalling, I warned her. The other good news was that Marilyn's sister had arranged to come from Macon to stay with her. Marilyn was still in seclusion, and I believed that having family nearby would help keep her spirits up. The bad news was that we were unable to make any progress in our attempts to refute Emma's devastating testimony. Woolfolk. With the help of Sister Marilyn, we contacted many of the guests who attended the ill-fated party in Macon, but none were able to shed further light on the events of that evening. Most of the people we spoke to didn't even know that Marilyn had disappeared for a period of time. None of them knew any ex-boyfriends with whom she might have had contact. We also compiled a list of potential character witnesses, but despite their willingness to confirm Marilyn's good character, I had little hope of the success of such efforts. Her past behavior is unlikely to convince the court in light of contrary evidence. Marcy was deep in online research, and I had just gotten off the phone when Lucius Rayford came into our office unexpectedly. He didn't usually make unannounced visits, so even though I was busy, I decided to take a few minutes to talk to him. I invited Marcy to join us, but she declined, saying that she was busy with something important right now and didn't want to lose her mind. Lucius didn't stay long, but his visit left me with a lot to think about. In fact, I was still sitting in my chair when Marcy ran into my office. "Mrs. Sarah, I think you'd better come and look at this," she said with urgency, pulling my hand. I followed her into her office, and she invited me to sit in front of the computer screen. I looked at the information displayed, but didn't see anything significant. "What should I look at, dear?" I asked her. "It's not what you see, but what you don't see," she answered rather mysteriously. Marcy began pointing out columns of information and explaining what they meant. She then opened several other windows with more data. "See what I mean, Mrs. Sarah?" she asked. "I really do, Marcy, I really do." "So what do we do now?" she asked. "First, I need to make a couple of phone calls, and you need to call Marilyn and find out when it will be convenient for her to meet her husband." Marcy simply smiled. The next day, I called Forrest Howell from Mason, Towson, and Donovan. "We are ready to meet with you to discuss a settlement," I told him. "Great," he replied almost gleefully. "Why don't we meet here again? I assume that our offices are more spacious than yours." I wasn't bothered by his small stiletto heel. I assumed that my agreement would make Howell more amenable to what I said next. "It will be all right, Mr. Howell, if all the main participants are present. Mrs. Marshall will, of course, come with us, and you should invite both General Marshall and Emma Woolfolk." "Emma Woolfolk? She is not a party to the settlement. Why does she need to be there?" He was indignant. "We only saw the testimony of Miss Woolfolk. My client believes she has the right to face her accuser in person." "Wait a minute," Howell objected. "This is supposed to be a meeting to discuss a settlement, not a confrontation." "Don't worry," I told him. "I assure you that my client will behave with restraint. But I also assure you that there will be no meeting and no settlement if my client is denied the right to see her accusers. She categorically insists. We can do it now and get it over with, or we can wait until the trial, whenever that is." Howell saw his opportunity for a quick fix slipping away and rushed to correct the situation. Okay, I didn't say they wouldn't be there. It's just that it's very unusual. However, if your client is truly ready to resolve this case, we will make sure that all parties are present." "I assure you," I said in a thin voice, "we will find a solution before the end of the meeting." A week passed before we could agree on a suitable time to meet, and Marcy and I did not reveal our strategy to Marilyn. "Too many opportunities for things to go wrong, Marcy," I told her. "Let's keep our cards close to our chest." As a result, Marilyn was clearly worried as we drove to the MTD offices. She had ordered a car so that neither of us would have to drive, and she fidgeted nervously as she sat together in the passenger compartment. Despite what I told Forrest Howell, Marilyn clearly did not want to face her husband and ex-girlfriend. To my surprise, Marcy reached out and took her hand. "Don't worry, Marilyn. Mrs. Sarah has everything under control. Everything will be fine." Marilyn smiled weakly and leaned back in her seat, but continued to hold Marcy's hand. "Those two seem to have gotten closer since this all started," I noted approvingly. When the elevator took us to the MTD offices, We were led into a large area designed more like a living room than a law firm conference room. No sooner had we sat down than Forrest Howell joined us. "I hope this is acceptable, Mrs. Cannon." "I thought this environment would be less confrontational," he said with a smile. I simply nodded. I could tell he was feeling very confident. This suited me quite well. A minute later, the door opened again and General Marshall and Emma walked in Woolfolk. The general was in uniform and with all his medals. I think he wanted to impress us. This was the first time I met Miss Woolfolk. She was slender and attractive, obviously several years younger than Marilyn Hart. As she entered, she carefully avoided Marilyn's gaze. I could understand that. "Well," Howell began, "as you can see, everything is here as agreed, so I think we can begin to discuss the terms of the settlement." "Actually," I interrupted him, "a few more people will be joining us in a few minutes. But I'll introduce them when they arrive." Howell looked at me uncertainly, but then apparently decided to let it pass. "Okay," Howell continued. "Now, as I said, the purpose of this meeting is to reach an agreement on the division of property based on the prenuptial agreement that Mrs. Cannon prepared." "Excuse me, Mr. Howell," I interrupted again, "but shouldn't any settlement discussion be based on the issue of Marilyn Hart Marshall's alleged infidelity?" "Of course," Howell answered impatiently. "It's already been decided. Based on Emma's affidavit Woolfolk," I added. I noticed that Miss Woolfolk shuddered slightly. "That's right, Mrs. Cannon, Miss Woolfolk, witnessed Mrs. Marshall's infidelity and gave her testimony under oath," Howell said impatiently. He spoke slowly, as if I were a child. I ignored Howell and turned to General Marshall. "And you are prepared to rely solely on the testimony of Miss Woolfolk, General, even if it means the end of your marriage to Marilyn?" Marcy looked at me questioningly. "We didn't discuss this." Howell tried to regain control of the meeting, but General Marshall's loud voice drowned him out. "Reluctantly, I have to believe what Miss Woolfolk. Of course, I was in Washington when all this happened. But Miss Woolfolk, I was there and saw what happened. She has no reason to lie about it." "Isn't that a good enough reason?" I asked, taking a photo out of my folder and handing it to him. The general's face turned bright red as he looked at the photograph, and his anger seemed to make him unable to speak. Howell reached out and snatched the photograph from his hands, then gasped as he realized what he was seeing. The photo clearly showed the general having sex with Emma Woolfolk. Howell was also at a loss for words, trying to comprehend the full implications of what he had seen. But before he could gather his thoughts, we all heard Emma's loud scream, "Woolfolk! They know harm, they know." "Shut up," the general hissed at her. "No," she replied, "they know, it's over harm." Then she grabbed the general's hand. "Look, forget about the money. It doesn't matter, we can still be together. We can leave, like we said, just you and me. Please, honey, please, let's just leave." Howell tried to get the situation back under control. "You cannot use this photograph, it is inadmissible in court." "Maybe, maybe not," I replied, "but I also have an affidavit from a maid who saw them together in the general's room at the Omni Hotel. I believe in New York they place a lot of weight on maids' affidavits." Howell was confused, but I ignored him and turned to Emma. "Woolfolk, I'm afraid, Miss Woolfolk, General Marshall will not go anywhere with you, with or without money." "Why not?" she exclaimed. "Because he will most likely spend the next few years in prison. You see, General Marshall is not a general at all. He is just a con artist posing as an officer." Emma fell into a chair in shock, but the general stood up, clenched his fists, and began to move threateningly towards me. Before any of us could move, Marcy slid out of her chair and stopped him. "Move again, General, and I'll break your shoulder," she hissed. Then, to my amazement, she looked up at me and winked. At that moment, the office door swung open and two men in dark suits entered. "Ah," I said, "my other guests have arrived. May I introduce Agents Murphy and Riordan of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The two agents quickly handcuffed Marshall, read him his Miranda rights, and led him away. I approached Emma Woolfolk, who was sitting in a chair, crying pitifully. When she saw me approaching, she flinched away, but I gently touched her arm, trying to calm her down. My dear, I see that you are guilty of perjury and complicity in fraud. But you are not the first woman to make a fool of herself for love, and I doubt that justice will be achieved if charges are brought against you. However, I do not think you have a lot of friends left here in Atlanta, and I doubt there is a married woman in the 5 counties who would let you get close to her husband. My advice is to start over somewhere else. I went back to Forrest Howell. He didn't look at me when I turned to him. My client will, of course, fulfill the terms of the prenuptial agreement that she signed. However, as you learned today, it was the general, not Mrs. Marshall, who cheated, and it is Mrs. Marshall who will file for divorce and make her claims against him. Of course, given the probable future of this unfortunate man, I very much doubt that he will have any property left to satisfy her claims. Moreover, I doubt that the Mason Company, Tosin and Donovan will be able to receive any fees from your client. I was about to leave, but then I turned to Howell and added, however, please feel free to pass on the news of our meeting today to your gossip mongers. I think Atlanta Gossip Girl will really like this story. With these words, Marilyn, Marcy, and I left the office. As we drove back, I squeezed Marcy's hand tightly. Thank you so much for protecting me. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened. When I saw him coming towards you, I froze for a moment. I just couldn't believe that an officer would hit a woman, Marcy said. But then I remembered that he was not a real officer, and I think I reacted instinctively as I was taught. When we arrived at Marilyn's house, she begged us to come in so we could discuss everything that had happened again. Even though I was exhausted from all these events, I agreed because I realized that she did not know the whole story. I think I understand about Emma and Harm now, Mary Sedlin, but how did you know about them? It's true, Marcy added. You never told me about this. I'm sorry for keeping you in the dark, I replied, but it was absolutely necessary to keep this a secret until we met. If even a hint of it got out, Marshall might disappear. But what made you suspect them in the first place? Marilyn asked. Marilyn, this will be hard for you to hear, but I'm pretty sure he started a relationship with Emma while he was engaged to you. I think he seduced her and then convinced her that the only way to be together was to help him deceive you and take over half of your assets. Marilyn shed a few more quiet tears, realizing how treacherous her Prince Charming had been all along. The thing is, I continued, if their little scheme had worked, I think Marshall would have left Emma soon after divorcing you. You see, Marcy felt there was something wrong with Harmon Marshall from the very beginning. After the day she spent at your house, she started researching the general. She started checking her military sources, but couldn't find anything about him. That's when she started to think that he wasn't a general at all. But the medals, his trip to Washington, Marilyn protested. Anyone can fly to Washington, I reminded her, and medals can be found in almost any pawn shop. Marilyn moaned. I continued my story. When Marcy showed me what she had found, or rather, not found, I called my boss. Atlanta FBI Bureau, he is an old friend of mine, and he was very interested in our findings. The Bureau conducted an investigation and quickly confirmed that the general was an imposter. But then they started digging deeper and discovered that this wasn't Marshall's first scam. In fact, he was wanted on a number of charges for scamming women across the country. Even though Marilyn already knew that her soon-to-be ex-husband was lying and trying to deceive her, finding out that he was actually a career criminal was very difficult for her, and I had one more blow to throw. The agents also discovered that Harmon Marshall is not his real name. The man you married had many aliases, but his mother called him Alan Sneed. All in all, I concluded, posing as a general was quite bold, but he decided that the opportunity to get his hands on the heiress's fortune was worth it. If he could pull it off, he would disappear and live large from now on. How could I be such a fool? Marilyn moaned. Please don't be too hard on yourself, I consoled her. It wasn't just you. He managed to deceive Emma Woolfolk, me, and almost everyone I met in Atlanta. He is a gifted liar who has gained people's trust over the years, and the FBI is thrilled to have him in custody. One of Marilyn's qualities that we noticed several times was her ability to think about others, even when she herself was in a difficult situation. She showed it again now. Poor Emma. I can't help but feel a little compassion for her. Even though she was part of his scheme and told these terrible lies about me, in a way she was a victim, just like me. I wasn't so ready to forgive Emma. It's true that Emma was deceived, but when she succumbed to temptation, she not only abandoned her moral values, but also betrayed her best friend. Now she will have to leave Atlanta like Eve was thrown out of paradise. Perhaps Emma does not deserve to go to prison for her sins, but she certainly deserves her exile. Well, all I know is that I would be in a bad place if it weren't for you and Marcy, Marilyn said. I can never thank you enough for what you did for me. She then stood up and hugged both of us. As we turned to leave, Marilyn caught Marcy's hand. I've especially enjoyed getting to know you all this time, she said sincerely. I hope you'll keep in touch with me. Marilyn may have lost one friend in this unfortunate incident, I thought, but it seems she's made a new one. As Marcy and I drove back to Virginia Highland, there was little conversation. We both had a lot to think about. When we arrived, I thought Marcy would want to get in her car and head home, but instead she followed me into the office. I knew she wanted to say something, so I just waited until she was ready. Finally, she looked at me and said, Mrs. Sarah, I think I owe you an apology. When you offered me this job, I wasn't very grateful. In fact, I told you that I really didn't want it because I wanted to help people in need. She took a deep breath. But the fact is, Marilyn needed our help just as much as Cora Hopewell did. It wouldn't be fair if Gerald was able to hide that money from her, and I'm glad we were able to get her what she deserved. But it would be no less unfair if this fake general deceived Marilyn and took away from her what rightfully belongs to her. And without us, Marilyn would be as helpless as Cora. She sighed. I still want to help the poor, Mrs. Sarah, but now I realize that there are a lot of people who need legal help, whether they live in the inner cities or in Buckhead. I'm sorry I felt that way about you. I took her hands. Marcy, there's no need to apologize. You spoke your mind, and that's what I wanted, someone who's not afraid to do it. If you changed your mind as a result of what happened, that's good too, because it means you are open to new ideas and ways of thinking. I lowered her hands. You did great, young lady. You've shown intelligence and initiative, you have good observational skills, and you've proven that you can work effectively with people from different walks of life. And it doesn't hurt that you know a few karate moves. We both smiled at this. Anyway, the 3-month trial period is almost over, I continued. I have no doubt that you have justified yourself. Now the only question is, did I pass the probationary period with you? Do you still want to work with me? She paused just long enough for me to begin to doubt whether I had assessed the situation correctly. So I was amazed when, with a wide smile on her lips, Marcy suddenly stood at attention, gave me a knife salute, and said, Ma'am, yes, ma'am. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.